So welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Vanessa Sung. I'm the Interim Executive Director here at Evidence for Democracy. Before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from Ottawa, which is located on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. So as you'll see in the title slide, our focus today is on environmental research. And we know that scientific research is not removed from the need for reconciliation. And for a discipline like environmental research, this is especially important because with the strong connections between Indigenous peoples and the land. Not only is informed consent and collaboration from Indigenous peoples in environmental research an ethical imperative, Indigenous knowledge and perspectives also improve our collective understanding of the land. So 3 years ago, a group that included Indigenous authors published a paper that translated the general intent of the relevant Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action into outcomes and approaches that can be employed by natural scientists. My colleague Nada will share the link in the chat. So I've included a few of the calls to action here on the screen for you. And these calls really challenge us to recognize that reconciliation requires a new way of conducting science. And I encourage you all to check out the paper to see all 10 calls to action. And I invite especially the researchers on this call, no matter what your discipline, to consider how you can enable reconciliation in your work. So for those of you meeting us for the first time, Evidence for Democracy, or E4D, is the leading nonprofit promoting and advocating for the transparent use of evidence in government decision-making in Canada. We do this work because we believe we all benefit when governments make decisions informed by the best available evidence. And through research, issue campaigns, and training, we empower the science community to participate in public policy while cultivating public demand for evidence-informed decision-making. Now, before we get into today's main event, just a few housekeeping notes. We have enabled both the chat and the Q&A function for you today, so feel free to use either of those. We really encourage everyone to ask questions, share comments, or even relevant resources if you would like. We do ask that if you have questions for the speakers, please try to submit those through the Q&A function so that I can find them easily and ask them on your behalf. And finally, we do have closed captions enabled, so feel free to navigate to the bottom of your screen, your Zoom screen, and enable that if you would like. Okay, so this month, E4D launched a Perspectives on Scientific Integrity in 2023 blog series to reflect on the state of scientific integrity in Canada today and how things have changed over the past decade. But first things first, what do we mean when we say scientific integrity? Well, the Government of Canada's model policy on scientific integrity defines it like this. It's the condition resulting from adherence to concepts of transparency, openness, high-quality work, avoidance of conflict of interest, and ensuring high standards of impartiality and research ethics. But broadly speaking, this also means that science can be conducted and communicated without any undue interference. And you'll hear more about that soon in the upcoming presentation. So we've been hearing from invited experts across sectors who've been reflecting on the progress that's been made on scientific integrity, the challenges we face today, and where we need to go. And if you haven't been following the series, I encourage you to check out the pieces on E4D's website, starting with this first piece that features a timeline of select events related to scientific integrity that have taken place in Canada since 2013, and I will drop a link in the chat. So to complement the series that E4D has been running on scientific integrity, we're really excited today to host two researchers from the Westwood Lab at Dalhousie University who will share their new study into interference in science in the Canadian environmental research space. I'll invite both MJ and Samantha to come on screen. There you are, welcome. Okay, so MJ Robertson is currently a research associate in the Westwood Lab and has a part-time position with the Ottawa-based grassroots group Empowerum as their networking and events coordinator. She has a master's degree in environmental studies at Dalhousie, which focused on political interference in science in the Canadian context and its impacts on environmental researchers. MJ also has a bachelor's in communications from the University of Ottawa, where she also completed co-ops in several federal government departments. And Samantha Chu will begin her master's in environmental studies at Dalhousie University this September under the supervision of Dr. Alana Westwood. She graduated from Dalhousie with a degree in management and a major in environment, sustainability, and society in spring of 2022. She also completed her fourth year honors thesis with Dr. Westwood, which focused on interference in environmental sciences and the influence of social identity factors. So without further ado, MJ and Samantha, please take it away.
Thanks, Vanessa. I'll just share the slides here. How is that looking?
We're good.
Good. Okay, great. Hi, folks. Thank you all for being here today to hear from us, and thank you again to Vanessa and to E4D for hosting us today so that we could present this research to you. As Vanessa mentioned, my name is Manjulika. I usually go by MJ. My pronouns are she and her. My colleague Sam and I are going to be presenting our research today focused on political interference in the environmental sciences and studies in Canada. Our work was an investigation of researchers' perspectives, and the project was conducted in the unceded region of Chibuktuk in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and contemporary lands of the Mi'kmaq people.
Yeah, so just a quick agenda of what we're going to be talking about today. We're first going to give an introduction about who we are. Then from there, we're going to go into a background and history of interference in Canada. From there, it'll be a summary of our research. So that's going to include our methods, results, discussions, limitations, and our recommendations coming out of the research. From there, we'll go into acknowledgements, and then we'll end off with a Q&A. So introduction. So I know we sort of already did this, but yeah, my name is Samantha. I typically go by Sam. Yeah, I did my degree in management and sustainability, and will be starting my master's in environmental studies in September, this September. I have experience in regards to work. I do have experience working in federal and provincial government, as well as nonprofit. So MJ.
Yeah, like Vanessa said, and we've already said, I just graduated from Dalhousie University with a master's in environmental studies. I'm now working as a research associate at Westwood Labs through the School for Resource and Environment Studies at Dal. Previous to that, I earned a BA in communications from the University of Ottawa, where I also conducted other research projects focused on environmental communications and political science. And while I was living in Ottawa, I've also worked in several federal government departments as a communications officer, including NRCan, Global Affairs, and National Defense. But you already know all of that, so we're going to get into the research. So reports of interference in science from around the globe have been growing, particularly over the last decade, where we've witnessed interference in the form of everything from budget cuts in places like the US, Canada, and Australia, to mass firings of researchers. And in some extreme cases, there's been life-threatening cases of break-ins in Brazil or imprisonment in Iran. Last year, researcher Dr. John A. Driscoll reported severe consequences being faced by ecological researchers in Australia who are experiencing undue interference with their work, fear of media misrepresentation, constraints from government employees, job loss, and as a result of that, some fairly severe mental health consequences. So this article by Dr. Driscoll et al. Gained international attention and inspired our research in particular because it begs the question of, like, is this happening anywhere else? And specifically, is this happening in Canada? So to our knowledge, academically rigorous study of interference in science, like what was conducted here by Driscoll, has not been conducted in Canada. As Vanessa mentioned, there is a blog post about this that you can read, but I'll just go over it briefly, which is the history of interference in science in Canada. So from 2011 to 2014, Canada was led by a conservative government. And not soon after that government was elected as a majority, the first accounts of muzzling or restrictions on communication from public sector scientists were being reported in the media. So in 2013, a rally was held on Parliament Hill to call attention to what scientists asserted was a government-led war on science. And then the following year, a public sector union group, the Professional Institute of the Public Service, or PIPSI, they conducted a study and found that 90% of public sector scientists felt restricted in their ability to conduct and communicate research, and 70% reported political interference with their work. So in the following year, Canada elected a majority Liberal government, and that government promised to lift burdensome restrictions placed on public sector scientists. So PIPSI then conducted a follow-up survey, and in 2017, they reported 50% of public sector researchers surveyed still felt obstructed in their ability to conduct and communicate research, and 40% reported ongoing political interference. So in 2018, the Liberal government introduced a model for scientific integrity policies, and they required the implementation of those policies across federal government departments in 2019. And those policies were designed to guarantee Canadian public sector scientists' right to communicate with the public about their areas of expertise and prevent political interference in conducting or dissemination of research. So what we wanted to do is conduct an up-to-date examination of researchers' perspective on their experience of interference.
So for our research, we included another angle or approach to the research. And so we wanted to understand if a researcher's social identity played a role in the amount or type of interference they were experiencing. Social identity refers to a person's membership and identification with a diverse social group. For example, religion, nationality, sexual orientation, ethnic group, and gender. Social identities are socially constructed and therefore socially experienced, and making this term particularly fitting for our research context. So research has shown that social identity does play a role in the workplace. And a lot of this research has found that marginalized groups are more likely to experience adverse outcomes in the workplace. So for example, discrimination and bullying, feeling less safe voicing opinions, disadvantaged organizational assent, and reduced job satisfaction. However, we also know that diverse voices in the workplace are really important. So diverse perspectives provide higher quality and quantity and impact of research, greater scientific novelty, and higher rates of scientific innovation. Researchers' identity can also influence their research interests, and so this is particularly important right now as climate change and other ecological deteriorations are shown to not impact all people equally. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, creating more equitable and barrier-free workplaces.
So we set out to do a couple of things. The overarching research objective was to develop the first academically rigorous study of interference in the environmental studies and sciences in Canada. And in doing so, we'd be able to document the prevalence of interference in science and its impacts. So our research questions included, do Canadian environmental researchers experience interference with their ability to conduct and communicate their work? From whom does this interference come, and what are its impacts? And then we also asked, does the experience of interference differ depending on research area, location, career stage, social identity, any of those kinds of demographic factors? And lastly, we wanted to know whether perceptions of interference have actually changed since the institution of those federal scientific integrity policies that were inspired by the model introduced in 2018. So before we get into the research, I just want to take a minute to clarify what we mean by interference in science. The definition that we used is here, which is the deliberate actions that result in both the reduced funding or capacity for research activities to levels insufficient to generate knowledge, and or the inability of scientists to communicate their results to the public or engage in effective knowledge transfer to inform decision-making. So it's about both their ability to conduct work and their ability to communicate it. To answer these research questions, we used a survey The survey asked researchers living in Canada and currently working in the environmental studies and sciences about their work and identity demographics, their experience of interference with their ability to conduct and communicate research, and their perception of policy changes and impacts. One thing to note here is that we did things a bit differently from some of the previous studies we mentioned, like the 2021 paper from Dr. Driscoll and the PIPSI studies. PIPSI surveyed exclusively scientists working in the public sector and federal government employees. So our survey was intentionally designed and distributed to a broader audience to gather data from folks in academia, government, industry, and nonprofits, because we wanted to look into a more holistic picture of how interference in science occurs and its impacts for different types of environmental researchers. So the survey itself had 31 questions. It was open for about a month, and it was sent out via scientific societies, as well as directly by our research team, to a list of Canadian email addresses of corresponding authors on relevant journal articles that were identified using a bibliometric search. After cleaning up the response data, there were 741 unique responses that were actually used in the data analysis. So results, what did we get? Survey responses came from actually all across Canada, with representation from each of Canada's 13 provinces and territories. And the majority of our respondents worked in the natural sciences. Most were affiliated with one or more scientific society. And the majority of our respondents identified as established career researchers, meaning they've been employed in the field for more than 5 years.
Yeah, so looking at the social identity part of this, so the social identity factors that we measured were gender, whether they identified as 2S LGBTQI+, race, perceived race, and disability status. Just at a glance, you can see that we were working with some pretty major sample size differences within the social identity factors that we measured. We also asked about whether respondents wore a religious signifier, but as our group size for that was like less than 10, to protect the identity of respondents, we omitted any data regarding that. That's as well for any respondents who identified as non-binary or other gender. Group size really did play a large role in during our data analysis. So for example, another example is race and perceived race. In the actual survey, we did not just have white and racialized, there were different groups. However, again, due to some really low sample sizes in some of these groups, we had to amalgamate them. I also want to note the difference that's made between race and perceived race. This is a question that usually comes up. The purpose of this distinction is to acknowledge that a person's race is not always the race they're perceived as. This is particularly common among biracial and multiracial people. Perceptions of race, though, really do matter. So, for example, white privilege is not just the experience by those who are white, but those who are perceived to be white. On another note, I just want to add that though we didn't really have a large enough sample size to concretely say anything about the demographics of researchers and scientists in the environmental sciences in Canada, like broadly, when comparing our sample to the Canadian population of at least 2016, the 2021 census data was not out yet, we found that our demographics were not representative of Canadian populations for some groups, so specifically gender, disability status, and 2S LGBTQI status. This, along with other research, we do feel, though, that though we don't necessarily have enough to say anything concretely, we do think that this is a glance actually at something at this. There's a, oh, sorry, a little nervous. Sorry, I'll keep going. This is not representative of Canadian population, of the Canadian population. Sorry. Okay.
All good. So, do they experience interference with their ability to conduct and communicate work? The short answer that I can give you right now is yes, but we're going to go over it in more detail than that. We found evidence of interference both with researchers' ability to conduct work and in their ability to communicate work. So most felt that they were allowed by their organization to speak directly to the media, but not all. Some said that they felt that their communications had been constrained by their organization, who prevented them from sharing their research with the public or the media. We're going to talk a little bit more about this later in the presentation, but I just want to note that you can see here that in most cases, our researchers do feel that they have been prevented from sharing information by their organization, which may seem like quite the contrast to what was being reported in Canada a decade ago. But it's important to remember here that these results reflect a wider range of sectors than the previous studies as well. So the PIPSI studies I mentioned that were looking only at federal government employees are going to have a slightly different perspective than the study that we did here, where we talked to researchers in various sectors. So the topic areas that were the most constrained in terms of communications were climate change, pollution, impact assessment for agriculture, mining, land use, urban development, as well as threatened species, changes to legislation, and Canada's big natural resource development areas, including commercial fishing and logging. These findings are consistent with what was previously reported and as a concern across Canada related to impact assessment for scientific research conducted in the public sector, as well as industry-led research. They are also consistent with what was reported anecdotally in the media between 2012 and 2013. But from whom does this interference come? Requests for researchers to make undue modification to their work came primarily from external research partners in government or industry, or from communications personnel, both internal and external to the researcher's organization. So I'll also just say before we continue on here that communications personnel may not necessarily be ill-intentioned when fulfilling their role to communicate scientific research. Their implicit responsibility is to communicate in ways that are most relevant and accessible to a pretty general audience most of the time. So issues arise when findings are inaccurately presented, which can lead to misconceptions or the dissemination of misinformation. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later, but differentiating between this kind of miscommunication, or in some cases like the spread of disinformation from politically motivated interference in science, isn't always an easy task. But we're going to come back to that later. As for public commentary specifically, our respondents reported restrictions on public commentary coming from primarily senior management, as well as the minister's office, workplace policy, middle management, and because of their workplace culture. Our survey respondents who said that they had experienced undue modification to their work indicated that modifications were most often requested because of political motivations, for example, to justify existing laws, policies, and regulations that would allow for resource development to continue despite negative environmental consequences, and to downplay environmental risks. So an example of that, one of our respondents said, managers and co-workers frequently asked me to downplay risks of oil and gas projects to increase the chances of projects being funded. Which leads us right into some of the impacts of interference. Firstly, there are sometimes impacts for the environment. In conducting our research, we learned that interference in researchers' ability to conduct and communicate work can lead to cases where the health and safety of Canadians has been compromised, which also has negative environmental impacts. There are also impacts for science communication. In blue, you can see 24% of our researchers surveyed said that they are aware of cases where information has been suppressed or altered, leading to incomplete, inaccurate, or misleading impressions by the public, regulated industry, or the media, government officials. And in the last yellow graph here, it shows 51% agree they are aware of instances where knowledge exchange for the purpose of developing evidence-based law and policy has been compromised due to political interference. So that also can lead to negative consequences for the environment that protected or not by law and policy and regulation happens at different levels. It's generally agreed upon, of course, that decisions should rely on the best available scientific information. So when that's corrupted, there can be major implications. Some of the worst impacts of interference, though, that we really focused on in our project was that actually in how researchers themselves are affected, particularly in terms of their job satisfaction. So in our study, we asked, did the researchers' experience differ based on those work demographics I mentioned or any social identity factors? So to answer this question, we were able to pull a couple of themes from our responses to survey questions, including the fear of engaging with the media, fear of negative career consequences for engaging in public commentary, and externally imposed constraints, meaning constraints on communication that were imposed by external factors like senior managers or upper management. We also looked at reports of undue modification to work, which should also be considered a kind of external source of interference. So we make this distinction because in the full-length version of the paper, we talk a lot more about kind of internalized interference, which covers these other two themes, the fear of engaging with the media or of negative consequences. And the reason we viewed these as, well, the reason we call these internalized sources of interference is because of how those fears and uncertainties have led some researchers to engage in certain forms of self-censorship. And in some cases, where they'll make the decision to decline an interview or exclude a set of results from a presentation to avoid backlash, upset, or any other consequences that they might be worried about in association with engaging to the media. So I'll let Sam walk us through some more of these results.
So some of the results from our data analyses were quite striking. Regarding fear of engaging with the media, early career researchers and women were found to be significantly more afraid of engaging with the media. All marginalized groups from each of our social identities and early career researchers were found to be significantly more fearful of negative career consequences than the majority group for that social identity factor. So what I mean by negative career consequences, that being fear of risking to funding opportunities or fear of reduced opportunities for advancement in the workplace. Racialized respondents and those with visible and or invisible disability were found to have significantly higher rates of externally imposed sources of interference. These sources being, like MJ already said, senior or middle management, workplace policy, or work colleagues. Finally, respondents with a visible and or invisible disability were found to experience undue modification to their work at a significantly higher rate than those without a disability. For all other social identity factors, different groups were found to experience undue modification at similar rates. So next, I'm just going to provide two visualizations of what some of these unique data analyses look like. So for the first example, this graph shows the normalized responses comparing men and women to the question regarding fear of media. If we bring our attention to the right side of the graph, to the breakdown of the responses of somewhat agree and strongly agree, we can see from percentage-wise, just very easily, that more women responded somewhat agree and strongly agree to this question. Increased fear of media by women was consistent with reports and research that we read, which finds that women are more likely to be at the receiving end of backlash in the media. There's actually a follow-up open text question to this in which respondents could add their own thoughts and opinions. And one respondent summarized this idea, well, like quite bluntly, and stated, "Seeing how women are treated on social media, I'm not interested in receiving that type of trolling, so I stay away from politics or adding commentary on social media." So for the second example, this graph shows that the normalized responses comparing respondents who identified as having a disability and those without a disability to whether they have experienced undue modification. Again, we can see from percentage-wise, just very visually, there's considerably more respondents with a visible and or invisible disability responded yes to that question. A possible reason or explanation for why this may be is that research has shown that people with a disability are sometimes held to a lower standard or considered less competent, and therefore may be more likely to experience modification to their work than colleagues without a disability.
So last, we're going to just chat quickly about whether perceptions have changed. And the short answer is yes. In the past few years, researchers do feel as if their ability to conduct and communicate research has definitely improved. What's interesting here, though, about these findings is that there is a lot of respondents in open text response who explained that it's actually no thanks to the scientific integrity policies themselves, but that improvements made actually happen post 2015 election of a Liberal government. So in this chart, it shows of the respondents who said they were aware of the policies, Likely, most of them are respondents from the public sector. 12% actually argued in open text response that political interference is ongoing in Canada. And 3% specifically mentioned federal funding as a source of constraint, which isn't something that we had expected to see. One of the limitations of the study is that there is no data is available to objectively verify the motivations of those who are perceived by our population to be the cause of interference. So in other words, like the data we collected is subjective reports of incidents that our respondents perceived as interference in science. The objective reality is that some of these incidents that they described may have been driven by nefarious intent for example, the intentional prevention of communication about a politicized topic. But in some cases, the incident described may have only been perceived that way. For example, like an incidental budget cutback that resulted in reduced funding for a research project isn't necessarily interference. So in other words, it is likely that there are legitimate and illegitimate forms of interference that were reported in the survey. But our ability to distinguish between the two is pretty limited because of the subjectivity of self-reported experience. So distinguishing between these two would require an investigation into alleged instances of interference from multiple sides, which was out of scope and not really the goal of the study. Our investigation is about the researcher's experience. So the reports that we received, even of illegitimate interference, are still valid reports of incidents where a researcher felt that their ability to conduct or communicate work was being interfered with. And interpreting the study's findings, it's important to understand that these results are examples of how a wide array of environmental researchers have perceived interference in its many forms from a variety of sources. So secondly, given the nature of the survey, our results may not necessarily generalize to all Canadian environmental researchers. Because of self-selection bias that can happen when employing the methodology that we did, participants who are interested in the topic of interference may be more likely to complete the survey, while those with little interest or no experience of interference may opt out. We did get some responses from folks who said that they have never experienced interference in science working as an environmental researcher in Canada, but we still may be seeing a bit of an overrepresentation of those who have experienced interference. Lastly, like Sam's mentioned already, with a smaller sample size than we were hoping for, we were prevented from reporting all of the demographic data that we collected, which also means that we weren't able to draw conclusions for individuals with intersectional identities, which we think would have been a really interesting lens to approach this work with. But that being said, like what the results tell us is that interference in science to some degree is ongoing. It is often politically and financially motivated by individuals who in a lot of cases are literally invested in prioritizing natural resource development over the environment. In addition to this, researchers themselves across Canada are experiencing ongoing negative impacts, including decreased job satisfaction and increased anxiety and stress, particularly for early career researchers and the other marginalized individuals and populations that Sam mentioned. There's evidence of a fear of the media and of a fear of negative consequences for engaging with the media, which is leading to issues of self-censorship that is cause for concern. And this whole process of interference in science really threatens effective knowledge transfer, and it widens the science policy gap, which can lead to a weakened democratic decision-making process and an ill-informed or an uninformed public.
So there are a number of recommendations that have come out of our research. Firstly, leading regular studies of interference in science in Canada and conducting research into accusations of political bias in federal funding agencies. Secondly, rigorous contemporary report of the demographics of environmental research in Canada. Though our research did give a glimpse, we cannot say anything. You would need a larger sample size to properly assess this. Thirdly, improving science communications by offering science communication and media training to researchers. This is essential as our research suggests that many researchers are afraid to speak with the media. And finally, implementing concrete actions against discrimination, such as anti-discrimination and anti-racism education within institutions.
Yeah, so we just want to quickly acknowledge and thank some of our research partners here before we wrap up. This research was housed by the Westwood Lab at Dalhousie University and was supervised directly by Dr. Alana Westwood, as well as Dr. Philippe Mongeon, Dr. Nika Cloutier, with major support and contribution additionally offered by Dr. Dawn A. Driscoll, Dr. Sachinsa Arif, Dr. Dej here, and Dr. Bessa Sung at E4D. This project was funded by Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and we received a bunch of in-kind support, including the hosting of this webinar from Evidence for Democracy. Thank you everyone for your time, and I think we are opening it up to questions.
Okay. Thank you, Sam and MJ, for that awesome presentation. It's such interesting work. I want to encourage everyone on this call to send in your questions now through the Q&A if you can. Otherwise, in the comments, we'll find those as well. I'm going to start off the Q&A section with a question of my own. And for sure, we'll get to the audience questions in a bit, but I'm going to use my moderator privileges to ask the first question. So do you think, the question is, are there comparable studies that have been done in other countries? And if so, how is the scientific interference situation in Canada? How does it compare to other countries?
Yeah, I think that, well, I mean, the main one that kind of, like I said, like inspired this research is the work that Dr. Dawn Driscoll conducted a couple of years ago in 2021 in Australia. And what they did was he sent out a survey to a particular scientific society membership, looking at the experience of ecological researchers specifically. So that's kind of the main and most recent work that we're aware of that is happening elsewhere. Over the past number of years, there's been, I think folks are fairly familiar. There's a lot of question of scientific integrity and the process of how that happens, especially at the federal government level in the States. In the last 5 years, there's been lots of questions about that. In the States, the terms most often used to describe what happens is censorship, whereas science suppression is another term that's a little bit more popular, used elsewhere in the world. Primarily, the reports that we're aware of are in the States and in Australia, but that's also limited by the fact that I speak some French, but not very well. And there was only so much research that we were able to conduct to kind of investigate where else this might be happening, especially if it was reported in other languages or in places where we didn't have access to the publications or the media there. So those are kind of the main places that we're mostly aware of. We know as well from our research, from kind of anecdotal reports and media reports, that there are cases of interference in science happening, like I mentioned, in Iran and in Brazil, where researchers are experiencing a very different situation, a very different set of consequences, which are sometimes life-threatening, which is very different than anything that we're aware of having ever happened in Canada, North America, or in Australia either. Our research partners have said that they're not aware of anything like that happening in Australia. But yeah, that's kind of what we've been made aware of. Obviously, I'm not 100% sure that I know of every instance of interference across the world, but those are the most prominent ones that we talked about.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Okay, so the first question that we got from the audience is about the PIP survey. So the question is, do you know why the PIP survey results are different? And I think they're referring to a comment you made early on in the presentation about why some of the results between your study and the PIP surveys may differ. Obviously, I think, we don't have all of the information behind the PIP surveys, but if you wanted to expand on your answer and perhaps speculate in an informed way, if you had more of an answer to provide.
Sorry, can you restate that question exactly? I think I have an answer, but I just want to make sure.
Yeah, so I think the results from the PIP survey, especially with regard to whether or not they can speak freely, if they're experiencing pressures to modify their work, were different in the PIP survey compared to your survey, and what you think might be causing those differences.
Oh yeah, of course. So actually I had I can share it with you. I had a slide that kind of outlines the results of those PIPSI surveys just for reference, because there's a few interesting points from them here. But I think that the main, our sense from, methodologically speaking, the primary difference between our study and the PIPSI study is that PIPSI is a professional union group who have access to a comprehensive list of scientists working in the public sector, and we're able to reach out to those folks and had a very specific audience to contact, and so they were able to provide a little bit more of a comprehensive reach, I guess, with their survey. Whereas for us, our team wasn't equipped with that much access to any specific population. So we had to do a little bit of, we had to kind of MacGyver our sample out of using a few different techniques and going through a few different sources and a few different areas like that. So that means that our group reached out to folks who are in the public sector, but also to a variety of individuals who don't work in the public sector and maybe have never worked in the public sector, which is industry personnel, a lot of folks from academia, as well as a few nonprofits that we were able to reach out to. So I would say the primary difference is that PIPSI is 100% focused on public sector experience, and our research just reflects a more diverse group. The other main difference, I think, in terms of findings from PIPSI's two surveys to our survey is that things have changed quite a lot. There's been a really big change to federal department level leadership. There's been a very big shift culturally, I think, towards a need for science and a reliance on science. I always hate to bring COVID into it, but in the past few years in Canada, obviously we've been really heavily reliant on the need for rigorously conducted, really effective and accurate scientific findings that we can use to inform decision making and best practices and regulation, and how we approach how we approach everything, I guess, in the past few years. And I think that change has allowed people to really has kind of shone a light on the importance of science at every level, and the need for it that we have. So I think that in the past few years, there's been that shift has kind of made people a little bit more oriented towards ensuring that scientific integrity is being protected and is being upheld, and that rigorous standards are being met. And I think that that kind of shift in the zeitgeist, I guess, is a really important thing to note.
Thank you. The next question is, were there any differences between early career and established researchers in the various aspects of environmental research interference?
Yeah, so the main difference is that our early career researchers seemed to be experiencing more challenge in terms of interference at the personal level, if that makes sense. So I know we talked a little bit about kind of external interference versus internalized sources of interference. And the main difference between our two groups is that we found that established career researchers are not so affected by internalized sources of interference. They had more similar experiences and expectations around externally imposed interference. For example, like reduction of funds, reduction of resources, definitely in the cases of senior management making undue modifications to work, those experiences were fairly similar. But I think that our early career researchers we found had a little bit more anxiety in terms of how they approach the media, how they approach engaging with public commentary. And I think that that's kind of understandable. At first, I was surprised to learn that. And then the more I kind of thought about it, the more I kind of thought, well, I mean, of course, they're a little bit more apprehensive about what they put out into the world because they're very early stages of their career, which means that the more established career researchers who have a little bit more experience with the media, probably who have more experience researching, who just, quite frankly, like have more publications and kind of more to back them. And that, in that sense, feel a little bit less apprehensive about engaging in public commentary and about processing those kinds of things. So I actually think that it hasn't been totally like earth-shattering to learn that our early career researchers are a little bit more apprehensive, I guess, about their public engagement. But yeah, I think that's kind of the main thing. Other than that, in terms of like topic area or research focus or anything like that, there wasn't any massive differences.
I can also quickly add to that. When we were looking at the demographics of like social identity demographics of early career researchers versus established career researchers, we found that for early career researchers, there was, well, we know in the data we had only like 38% female and it was over 60% male. But then when we looked at just early career researchers, we found there's actually more women as early career researchers, which could have played into it as our results showed that women were significantly more afraid of engaging with the media. So this is just the focus on engaging with the media aspect of that question, but could have played into it. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Those are both really important additional insights. And I think those results would be pretty well aligned in many other different disciplines and sectors as well. Those who are early in their career tend to be afraid of and face more severe consequences when they're considered to be acting perceived to be acting inappropriately or against established policy. So I think that makes a lot of sense.
Existing highly politicized spaces, I think, is a risk for anyone, but particularly for those who are just kind of starting out.
That's right. There's a question here about, first they said great presentation, which of course I agree with.
Thank you.
How did you come up with your definition of interference?
Yeah, so the definition of interference in science was an interesting journey kind of through existing literature. What happened with the definition of the interference in science is that when we set out to start looking at this research, we did a lot of searching through databases, through media, through gray lit, through white papers, through kind of anything and everything that we could find that documented what we were talking about. And what we found was that there's a lot of competing terminology out there in this presentation alone, we've talked about censorship, science suppression, interference in science. We've also used constrain, block, restrict, suppress. Like there's a lot of terminology out there. And what we found fairly early on in the research process is that we were going to have to use, just for the sake of putting in like a Boolean search into a database, using syntax and different keywords, we had to use a lot of different keywords to find a comprehensive list of existing publications that related to the work that we were doing. And like I said, a lot of that terminology, there was just a lot of competing terminology that already existed in the world. In addition to that, interference with science, political interference, and just interference alone are actually all key terms that have been used in various different publications and in different formats in the media, as well as in like academically rigorous papers in gray literature, et cetera, and all of those works. So all of those had been out there, but what we also found with those terms was that actually there wasn't any really solid definition that was attached to any of those terms either. And when we were looking at it based on our assessment of everything that was going on, what we found is that there was actually kind of two things going on, which is that there was a reduction in funding, reduction in resources, those kinds of things that led to challenges in researchers' ability to conduct work. And that was one thing that was definitely going on. And then the other thing that was going on the other hand, was restrictions on researchers' ability to communicate work. There was a time where scientists working in the public sector, when they attended conferences, they had media personnel that were assigned to them and had to come with them and take note of everything that they said and approve their answers before they spoke and do all of those kinds of things. And there was really a lot of restriction happening as well on the communication side. Sometimes there was a few anecdotal reports that we heard of folks who had been contacted to give an interview, and while they were going through the due process of getting that interview kind of approved by their media team, the media team would delay and delay and delay, and it would pass the deadline for them to respond to the journalist that reached out to them. And so there was a lot of complications like that. But the way that we saw it is that there was actually two different things going on here, which is that there was restrictions on ability to conduct work and restrictions on ability to communicate work. And the most popular terminology that was used in Canada, and arguably like the most recognizable terminology to refer to what we were talking about, is this word muzzling that became really popular in 2013 and was really popularized by the media, particularly. And that was being used a lot, and it actually resurfaced in a lot of media reports in the States around 2020. There was a lot of reuse of the word muzzling as well. And so that's arguably like the most recognizable. And I had a lot of people ask me, why didn't you just, say muzzling? But it's because muzzling quite specifically referred to those restrictions on communication. And what we were hearing from our researchers as well was that there was quite a lot of restriction happening even before we get to the communication stage, which was in the ability to conduct work, the ability to find funding for work, the ability to resource yourself or your lab or your team or whatever. So what we wanted to do was develop a new definition that was well defined and based kind of empirically, as opposed to what we were seeing, which is the use of the word interference or interference with science or political interference that was being used but wasn't really attached to any cohesive definition of it. So we wanted to come up with, like I said, like a rigorous kind of like definition for interference in science, but especially one that reflected both those two sides of the coin of interference, of the inability to conduct research and the inability to communicate research. So we went through a lot of different drafts of that definition of interference in science as well, before we kind of nailed down on something that we thought really accurately reflected kind of the whole picture of what interference in science has looked like in Canada and what it continues to look like now.
Thank you for that very comprehensive answer. And
that's a whole other paper.
And I think, I do think it's important to talk about scientific interference, beyond just kind of the inability to speak to the media, because like you said, there are a lot of indirect ways, including what was pointed out by some within your survey, to prevent, science from being communicated or conducted. For example, the funding piece that you thought, you found to be a little bit of a surprise. I think a lot of people might be surprised to find that, the federal public service science has been, spending on federal public science has been declining, taking inflation into account since 2010. There was a small bump in 2015,
Yeah.
but it really hasn't recovered ever. So, you know, that is a huge piece of that as well. 5 minutes left. Lots of questions still, so I'm gonna have to be a little selective here, but there is a question here. So as the question asker understands it, your focus has been on scientific research conducted by typically PhD level scientists working in universities or government institutions. I think you also mentioned industry and nonprofit. The assumption seems to be that unhindered, these scientists would be unbiased. Is that so? Can you comment?
Yeah. I think, I mean, my kind of like my instinctual answer is that yes, I would assume, we do assume that without restriction, without guidance, without any kind of external sources or direction, that these scientists would be pursuing an unbiased approach to research. I think that, I mean, it's naive not to note that all research is biased by the humans that conduct it, because that's how human beings conducting research is, unfortunately. But yeah, we are operating on, like, to be brief, I guess, we are operating on the assumption that all scientists would be meeting a standard of scientific integrity and rigor that dictates trying to measure out as much bias as is possible with human conducted research.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, so you didn't look into it, but the question asker is curious about what your opinions might be on how interdisciplinary training, or even just comms or media training, might influence the level of comfort scientists have in engaging with the media.
Right. Yeah, I think that there was a book that came out in 2013 by Canadian author Chris Turner called The War on Science, and he talks a lot about he kind of paints this picture of that rally that took place in 2013 in a very in a really beautiful way, I think. But but he really emphasizes in there something that I kind of hadn't really thought of, maybe because I'm a little bit younger, but he kind of explained how these people, these scientists and these researchers who were marching had not necessarily ever marched for anything. And it was this big shift in 2013 where scientists became not people who sat in the lab and did their work and weren't political and had no biases, had no political allegiances, had no feelings or thoughts about any of that, just kind of did their science. And that interference in science had forced them into this position where they then had to also, where they not only were responsible for conducting that science, but also that they were responsible now for advocating for themselves and for advocating for that science and advocating for the need for it and advocating for like why and how it should be conducted and what scientific rigor should look like and all of these things that puts them in a very different position than one that they were in before, which is to play the role of educator and play the role of advocate and play the role of communicator. And what really happened there is that is that kind of the position shifted. For me, I have a background in communications and work as a social scientist and a researcher, but a lot of my colleagues and other folks at my lab are researchers who I work with now, and what we talk about is how to communicate that. So I think that there's two ways that you can exist in science communication, is that you can come from a science background and to communicate, or you can come from a communications background into science. And I think that folks who come from a science background, but who are now in a position as a scientist of being required to advocate for themselves and communicate their work and be responsible for all of those things, those folks, I think that media training, science communication training, training on just how to translate all of that complex information and all of the jargon into something that can be understood easily by a layman audience is really, really valuable, because it means that you don't have to go through those other people who are trained in communications. You can get on Twitter yourself and put your own research out there yourself, which I think is a really valuable part of the process of being a scientist who can engage and who can conduct and communicate work free from interference and free from modification to that work and free from all of those other barriers.
Thanks. That's a great answer. And that transition you were talking about scientists kind of switching into this mode where they're advocating for themselves. It's a big reason why evidence for democracy even exists. So I really appreciate that answer.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're at the end of our time, but I did want to end with this question, which is, what are some, very quickly, what are some of the questions that you still have about interference in the Canadian environment, the Canadian environmental research space, or even broadly just kind of scientific space, and what is the Westwood Lab planning to pursue next?
Really quickly, we'd love a bigger sample. We'd love to get so many more people involved. I'd love to know a little bit more quantitatively, like what is going on specifically in the public sector, what's going on in industry, what's going on in academia, and kind of get a lot more data that answers just a lot more questions. The main question we have is just like, what's going on outside of the 741 responses that we got. We kind of want to know everything else. I think that one of our other bigger questions is that we'd love to have an opportunity to learn more about the personal identity demographics and the social identity demographics of everyone who is working in environmental research, because obviously Sam and I think that that's really valuable and really interesting. And I think it's really important for us to think about how we treat people and making sure that our science and that in every area is representative of the population, and that science, and particularly that environmental science, is being conducted and represented by the people who are like kind of disproportionately affected by that, which we know is marginalized identity groups. So I think that's kind of like our big questions. Like, we just kind of want to know the same stuff, but for everyone else, I guess. And the Westwood Lab, generally speaking, and Sam and I specifically, has really oriented ourselves towards this broader issue, this kind of umbrella of knowledge exchange, where we talk a lot more about the science policy gap, and we talk about how we fill that and how we create evidence-informed decision-making and patterns of communication that really effectively facilitate that evidence-informed decision-making. We know that to mitigate the effects of climate change and to make big differences and to make changes, we need to have science in the room. So what the Westwood Lab and what my research and Sam's research is really oriented towards now is really understanding kind of how to make that happen and how to make sure that the best available scientific evidence is in the room and is being used to inform decision-making, which can, for the folks who are drafting the law and the policy and the regulations that dictate how we treat our environment and how we protect it moving forward.
Absolutely. And I'm very glad to hear that the Westwood Lab is on it.
Doing our best.
MJ, Sam, thank you both so much for this excellent presentation and discussion. Thank you to the audience for joining today and for your excellent questions. I hope you found this webinar interesting and helpful. If you have any more questions about the work that was presented, I'm sure you can reach out, and Sam and MJ would be happy to chat with you more about that. One last thing, you'll receive a feedback survey after you sign off. We love feedback, and so please take a minute to fill it out and let us know what you thought of this session. And with that, thanks to everyone again, and have a lovely rest of your afternoon.
Thanks, folks.